Cole figured the cold was a kind of honesty. It didn't pretend to be anything but what it was, a force that could kill you if you weren't paying attention. His cabin, nestled in a high mountain valley, was a testament to paying attention. The logs were chink tight against the wind, the stone fireplace drew clean, and his stores, while meager, were precisely catalogued. Yet, for all his competence, the place was hollow. The silence was a physical weight. He could mend a fence line with his eyes closed, but couldn't manage a simple tear in his shirt. His fingers, thick and calloused from axe handles and reins, fumbled the needle until he swore and threw the garment into a corner. That night, dinner was the same as most nights: salted beef, hard, and a chunk of bread that tasted of loneliness. He had sent the letter and the money weeks ago, a transaction born of desperation. He hadn't asked for a companion. He had paid for a service, a housekeeper, someone to manage the inside of this place while he managed the outside. In his mind, she was a stout, hardy woman from back east, someone who wouldn't be spooked by the isolation or the work. He expected practicality, not grace. He expected a solution to the fraying edges of his solitary life, a way to keep the encroaching chaos at bay. The arrangement was simple. She would work, and she would have shelter through the winter. It was a fair trade, a business deal. He wasn't paying for conversation or comfort. He was paying for order. He was buying back a piece of his own focus, which had been splintering under the constant, grinding pressure of doing everything himself. The thought of another presence in his space was an irritant, a necessary one he would have to endure. He just needed her to be quiet, efficient, and unremarkable. That was the deal he'd made with himself. He was a man who understood deals. He just didn't understand how profoundly this one was about to be broken. The man who brought her didn't even dismount. He rode to the edge of the clearing, a small figure huddled behind him, and gestured toward the cabin. Cole watched from the doorway, rifle held loosely in one hand. The rider exchanged a few quick words, then nudged his horse and was gone, leaving the figure standing alone in the vast, unforgiving snow. It wasn't the stout woman he'd pictured. This was a woman, slight and fine-boned, swallowed by a worn wool cloak. As she approached, her steps hesitant but deliberate, he saw her face. She was young, maybe 30, and Chinese. Her expression was a careful mask of neutrality, but her eyes held a deep, quiet fear. She stopped a respectful distance away, her hands clasped in front of a simple gray prairie dress. This was not the housekeeper he had paid for. This was a mistake, a complication. His first instinct was to send her back, but back where? The man was gone, and the nearest town was a 2-day ride in good weather. This was not good weather. "There's been an error," he said, his voice a low growl. "I was expecting someone else." She didn't flinch. She simply met his gaze and spoke, her English accented but clear. "My name is Lynn. The agency sent me. The payment was received." Her dignity was a shield. She stood there, a fragile thing in a world of granite and ice, and refused to be dismissed. Cole felt a surge of frustration. He had paid for a simple service, and instead he'd been given a problem that looked him right in the eye. He ran a hand over his face, the cold air biting his skin. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to maintain the hard-won solitude of his life. But turning her out meant leaving her to die. Even he wasn't that hard. "Fine," he bit out, the word tasting like defeat. "The deal stands. You work. You earn your keep." He stepped aside, holding the cabin door open just enough for her to pass. "Don't expect anything more." She walked past him, a faint scent of soap and cold air following her in. The cabin seemed to shrink with her presence, the silence he was used to now filled with the sound of another person's breathing. The transaction had been made, but the terms had changed before it had even begun. Cabin evening. The first day was a silent battle of wills. Cole laid out the rules with blunt, clipped sentences. He pointed to a small cot in the corner, separated from the main living space by a hanging blanket. "That's yours. Everything else is mine. You cook, you clean, you mend. You don't touch my tools. You don't ask questions. You stay out of my way." Lynn listened without a word, her hands folded, her posture radiating a stillness that unnerved him. He expected argument or tears or pleas. He got none of it. She simply nodded once, a small, sharp dip of her head that was both agreement and a strange kind of dismissal. Then she began to work. She moved with a quiet, fluid efficiency that was mesmerizing. She didn't scrub and bang things about. She wiped and folded and sorted, bringing a subtle order to his chaotic space. The pile of dirty dishes vanished. The dusty table was cleared and wiped down with a damp cloth. The shirt he had thrown in the corner in frustration was picked up, inspected, and placed in a small pile for mending. He sat by the fire, pretending to clean his rifle, but he watched her every move. He was looking for a flaw, a sign of weakness or complaint that would justify his resentment. He found none. She worked as if she were born to it, but also as if she were 1,000 miles away. When she prepared the evening meal, she used the same meager ingredients he always did, but the result was entirely different. The salted beef was simmered with a few dried herbs she found in his pantry, releasing an aroma that made his stomach clench with a forgotten kind of hunger. She served him a bowl without a word, then took a smaller portion for herself and ate quietly on her cot behind the blanket. The food was warm. It was good. He hated to admit it. This was not the arrangement he had envisioned. He had wanted a functionary, a ghost to perform tasks. Instead, he had a person, a quiet, observant presence whose competence was a silent rebuke to his own neglect. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was watchful. Outside the next day. The cold deepened, settling over the valley like a shroud. Cole spent the day chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. He worked until his muscles burned and sweat froze on his brow, trying to push away the unsettling feeling of another person in his home. When he came inside, stamping snow from his boots, he didn't see where he'd left the axe. He'd leaned it carelessly against the woodpile just inside the door, and in his exhaustion, he knocked it over. The blade glanced off his boot and sliced a clean, deep gash across the back of his hand. Blood welled up instantly, dark against his pale skin. He swore, a raw, guttural sound of pain and fury. His first instinct was to hide it, to wrap it in a dirty rag and ignore it. Weakness was a liability he couldn't afford. He turned toward the fireplace, his back to her, fumbling for a strip of cloth. But she had heard. Lynn stepped out from behind the curtain, her eyes immediately finding the source of his curse. She saw the blood dripping onto the floorboards. For a moment she hesitated, honoring the boundary he had so fiercely established. Then she moved. She didn't ask permission. She took a clean cloth from a small pile she had boiled and dried that morning, and a tin of salve from her meager belongings. She approached him not with pity, but with purpose. "Hold still," she said, her voice soft but firm. He wanted to shove her away, to tell her he could handle it, but the authority in her voice and the sharp, throbbing pain in his hand held him in place. She gently took his wrist, her fingers surprisingly strong. He flinched but didn't pull back. Her touch was light, clinical, as she cleaned the wound. He watched her dark hair fall forward as she concentrated, her expression serene. She applied the salve and wrapped the hand neatly and tightly. It was the first time anyone had touched him with care in years. When she was done, she met his eyes for a second. "It will need to be kept clean," she said, and then she retreated back to her side of the cabin, leaving him standing there with his neatly bandaged hand and a profound sense of dislocation. The rule had been broken. A line had been crossed. Not with words, but with an act of simple, undeniable grace. By the fire. A week passed. The unspoken language between them grew. Respect was not given. It was earned in the small daily acts of survival. Cole began to notice things. The firewood bin was never empty because she would bring in logs throughout the day, never letting the supply dwindle. The water buckets were always full. The cabin, once just a shelter, began to feel different. It smelled of baking bread and drying herbs. Lynn had found a small patch of wild thyme near the creek, half buried in snow, and used it to transform their bland meals. She wasted nothing. Every scrap of food, every piece of thread, was used with intention. He found he was eating better than he had in years, his body feeling stronger, more resilient. He never said thank you. He never complimented the food. But one afternoon, after he returned from checking his trap lines, he found her struggling to sharpen a dull kitchen knife on a worn whetstone. Her small hands lacked the force to get a proper edge. He watched her for a moment, her brow furrowed in concentration. Without a word, he took the knife from her hand. He strode to his workbench, picked up his own perfectly maintained whetstone, and began to sharpen the blade with long, expert strokes. The sound of steel on stone filled the cabin. He worked until the blade was razor sharp, testing it against his thumb. Then he walked back and handed it to her, handle first. Their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting contact, but it sent a jolt through him. "Be careful," he grunted. "It's sharp now." She took the knife, her eyes holding his for a moment longer than necessary. A flicker of something, understanding, maybe even a hint of a smile, passed across her face before she turned back to her work. That evening he left a small, freshly skinned rabbit on the table for her. It was his way of saying he had noticed. It was his way of saying her efforts were not in vain. It was the closest he could get to an admission that her presence was no longer just a transaction, but a contribution he was beginning to depend on. The storm clears. The world outside was a pristine, dangerous beauty. Ice coated every branch, and the snow was deep enough to swallow a man. Lynn, determined to prove she could manage her share of the outdoor work, insisted on fetching the water from the well herself. Cole had watched her from the window, a knot of unease in his gut. The path was treacherous. He saw her reach the well, her small frame straining as she lowered the heavy wooden bucket. On the way back it happened. Her foot slipped on a patch of black ice hidden beneath a dusting of new snow. She went down hard, the full bucket flying from her grasp and crashing to the ground, its contents splashing across the frozen earth. He was out the door before the sound of the impact had faded. His first thought was anger at the wasted water, at her stubbornness, but when he reached her, the anger vanished. She was pushing herself up, her face pale and etched with humiliation. There was a tear in her gray dress at the knee, and he could see a raw scrape beneath it. She wasn't crying, but her shoulders were trembling slightly, either from the cold or the shock. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The water." He didn't yell. He didn't scold her. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not an employee who had failed a task, but a woman trying her best in impossible conditions. He extended a hand. "Ice is treacherous," he said, the words gruff. It was his way of offering an excuse, of shouldering some of the blame for the dangerous conditions. She hesitated for a second before taking his hand. Her fingers were ice cold in his warm, calloused grip. He pulled her to her feet easily. She swayed for a moment, and he kept his hand on her arm to steady her. "Go inside," he ordered, his tone softer than he intended. "Get warm." He picked up the empty bucket and drew the next 2 loads of water himself, his movements sure and steady. He had wanted her to be invisible, to stay out of his way, But in that moment of shared failure and imperfect reassurance, he realized he had been watching her all along. He was no longer just her employer. He was becoming her protector. Snow whirls outside. The blizzard arrived without warning, a furious white wall that descended from the peaks and consumed the world. For 3 days they were prisoners in the cabin. The wind shrieked like a dying animal, rattling the window panes and forcing fine powder snow through invisible cracks in the logs. The world beyond their 4 walls ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, the roaring fire and the howling storm. The forced proximity changed everything. There was no escaping each other, no work outside to create distance. They moved in a careful choreography in the small space, their routines overlapping. He would stoke the fire and check the integrity of the door and windows. She would ensure they had hot broth and that their dwindling supply of candles was used sparingly. On the second night, a new sound joined the storm's chorus, the lonely, hungry howl of a wolf, shockingly close to the cabin. Cole saw Lynn flinch, her eyes wide with fear. He moved to the hearth and took down his rifle, checking the load with practiced movements. He didn't say anything comforting. That wasn't his way. Instead, he simply sat in his chair, the rifle laid across his lap, his gaze fixed on the door. He was a sentinel, a silent promise of safety. His presence was a shield against the wildness outside. Lynn watched him for a long time. Then she ladled a steaming mug of broth and brought it to him. She set it on the small table beside his chair. "You should eat," she said quietly. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving the door. In the flickering firelight, they were no longer a man and the woman he'd hired. They were 2 souls huddled together against the vast, violent indifference of the wilderness. The storm was stripping away the pretense of their arrangement, revealing a more fundamental truth. They needed each other to survive. Fear was the great equalizer, and in its grip they had become, without ever admitting it, a team. By dawn, the blizzard broke, leaving behind a world sculpted in silence and deep, pristine snow. The oppressive roar of the wind was gone, replaced by a quiet so profound it felt sacred. The tension of the last few days lingered in the cabin, but it had changed. It was no longer the friction of strangers, but the shared exhaustion of survivors. That evening the fire crackled, casting a warm, dancing light on the rough-hewn walls. Cole was oiling a piece of leather harness, the familiar task a comfort. Lynn sat on her stool, not behind her curtain but nearer to the fire's warmth. In her hands was the shirt he had torn weeks ago, the one he had failed to mend. Her needle moved with a steady, graceful rhythm, the tiny stitches almost invisible. The silence between them was comfortable now, a shared space rather than an empty one. "You handle a needle well," Cole said, the words abrupt in the quiet room. It was the first compliment he had ever given her. She paused her work, looking down at the fabric in her lap. "My husband was a tailor," she said, her voice soft. "In our village. He taught me to make stitches that would hold." It was the first she had spoken of him. Cole stopped his work, sensing a story waiting to be told. He remained silent, giving her the space to continue if she chose. "He wanted a better life for us," she said, her gaze distant. "He heard there was work, a chance. He was not strong. The journey, the sickness came quickly." She didn't cry. Her pain was a quiet, stoic thing. "He made this dress for me. He said gray was a practical color." She smoothed a wrinkle in the fabric with her thumb. The confession hung in the air, a small, painful truth offered in the safety of the firelight. After a long moment, Cole cleared his throat. "I had a brother," he said, his own voice rough with disuse. "Younger. He thought he was invincible. Went up into the peaks during an early thaw. The mountain didn't care how invincible he thought he was." It was a story he hadn't told anyone. He had buried his grief under layers of solitude and hard work, but in the warm glow of the fire, with this quiet woman who understood loss, A small piece of it saw the light. The wall between them, already cracked, had finally begun to crumble. Hunger. The blizzard had decimated his trap lines and driven the game deep into hiding. Their supplies, already low, were now critical. Salted beef was gone. They were down to a handful of potatoes and a half sack of flour. Hunger became a third presence in the cabin, a gnawing ache that sharpened the edges of everything. There was no choice. Cole had to hunt. He checked his rifle, packed a small satchel with a piece of hardtack and a skin of water, and pulled on his heaviest coat. Lynn watched him, her face a mask of worry. The snow was deep and unstable, the air brutally cold. "I'll be back by dusk," he promised. The words meant as a reassurance for her, but also for himself. He set out into the blinding white landscape. Hours passed. The sun, a pale disk in the winter sky, began its descent. Dusk settled, painting the snow in shades of purple and gray. Lynn lit a lantern and placed it in the window, a tiny beacon in the immense darkness. She paced the small cabin, her fear a cold, tight knot. Night fell completely. The fire was the only light, the only warmth. It was hours past his promised return when she finally heard it, a stumbling, dragging sound outside the door. She threw it open. Cole was there, leaning heavily against the frame, half covered in snow. He was dragging a small doe behind him, a victory against starvation, but his face was ashen with pain. He collapsed just inside the doorway. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, a piece of jagged bone protruding from a bloody tear in his trousers. He had fallen on an icy rock face. The hunt had succeeded, but it had cost him dearly. All pretense vanished. She was no longer a housekeeper, and he was no longer her master. He was a man, broken and feverish, and she was the only one who could save him. She dragged him toward the fire, her strength born of pure adrenaline. He was delirious, muttering. As she worked to cut away the fabric from the wound, his hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. His eyes, glazed with fever, found hers. "Don't," he rasped. "Don't leave." Her own fear was a cold wave, but her voice was steady when she answered, a vow made in the heart of the storm. "I will not leave you. Grace." The days that followed were a blur of fear and desperate work. The fever took hold of Cole, leaving him shivering and delirious one moment, burning hot the next. Lynn became his anchor in a sea of pain. She cleaned and set the wound as best she could, using strips of her own petticoat for bandages and whiskey from his small stash to sterilize the injury. She forced broth between his chapped lips, melted snow for clean water, and never let the fire die down. She slept in the chair beside his bed, a hand resting on his forehead to gauge the fever's heat. His pride was stripped away, leaving only raw vulnerability. One afternoon, when he was finally strong enough to sit in his chair by the fire, he gestured to the small wooden box where he kept his money. "Bring me that." She did as he asked. He opened it and took out the pouch of coins, the payment for her service. He held it out to her. "This was for a housekeeper," he said, his gaze steady and direct. "That contract is finished." She looked at the money, then back at him, her expression unreadable. He pushed the box aside and reached for her hand, his grip gentle. "I don't need a housekeeper, Lynn. I need a partner." A small, genuine smile finally touched her lips, transforming her face. The word hung in the air between them, a promise of a new beginning. The winter was still outside, but inside the cabin the thaw had finally come. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a home.